feel free to ask any questions to all these presenters. Again, this is being recorded, but speak up and I'll ask Jack and Chris and Mark to repeat the question back just so that we catch it on audio. And yeah, we have a good bit of time, so go ahead.
Okay, before we take your questions, I have 2 questions for them to just kind of prime the pump. So the first question for you gentlemen is, in kicking this off, what was the hardest aspect of getting it off the ground in your organization? Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think the hardest thing, I think there were 2 hard things. One was finding the right people across the organization that collect some of the data. You know, you can, especially the business data, when you're trying to collect some of the loss information. You know, it took us a little while to find and get a copy of our credit monitoring and notification contract. It wasn't a state secret. It wasn't something that was even marked highly restricted confidential information. But it was something where we had to, you know, talk to privacy, we had to talk to legal, we had to go find the right person in procurement. They then had to go dig through and find it, and it was just a matter of like data collection in a large organization was pretty difficult. I think the second thing is, and this is something that we had to do in our organization, and I think a lot of banking institutions have to do this as well, is model risk governance. So we had to take the FAIR model, put it through our model risk governance process so that we can make sure that if we're making decisions using this model, that it has the right efficacy in the model. It's not something that is, you know, as you mentioned earlier, you know, it's not a bad model. And ultimately that took a lot of work because we had to work with folks from our enterprise risk group, our model risk management group, our partner that we were leveraging to just have the discussion around that, and then checking all the appropriate boxes to make sure that we were doing it the right way.
I love the comment about model risk management for a lot of reasons. For one thing, I love the fact that it undergoes and passes those sort of reviews. But just a little tidbit for you to think about. All right, FAIR has been through these kinds of reviews over and over and over again and has passed them. But who does model risk management on its median? Nobody. Nobody even hardly ever challenges those models. And so I just find it almost ironic that, you know, you put forth a model like this, and it should undergo these sorts of reviews, but nobody challenges the mental models, and it absolutely need to be.
I would say the biggest challenge for us was breaking down, and I don't know if it's exactly what you said right there, but I was going to say getting people out of what they've done for years. Either nothing, or I am so ingrained that I'm going to dig my heels in, and there's nothing wrong, right? Why would we ever change it? And I know we talked about it earlier, but as you gather the different teams, the functional inputs, herding all of those cats and ensuring that you're doing it with professionalism and respect, as opposed to telling them that they're flat out wrong. That was a challenge for me.
I was raising my hand. That was my mode. No, you're wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
Hey, Mark, you had something about like getting agreement for some of the whatever line of business or subject matter experts for the loss tables or something like that. So, you know, you're doing these analyses and you're coming up with some most likely, you know, it's $40,000, whatever it is, kind of thing. So you're kind of maybe going back to the subject matter experts and kind of getting a gut check from them, or can you kind of explain a little more about how that kind of works?
Sure. I don't know if everyone could hear that, but basically it's how do you calculate your loss tables? I mean, is essentially the question. We get everyone in a room and we have the conversation so that everyone can hear it. And there are some that are just cut and dry. We pay external counsel, a partner in external counsel, $800 an hour, junior partners $400, junior associates $200, right? In this type of scenario, how many hours do you think we'll need? Oh, that's going to be 5 of those people, and it's going to be 25 hours or 2,500 hours, right? So there's some black and white, cut and dry. When we get into some of the softer numbers, reputational risk, right, or whatever we're gonna call that, I mean, you want to light up a room, start talking about reputational risk. And just to let you know, when we calculate, we don't do competitive and we don't do reputational. We feel like we have a good understanding that if push came to shove and we needed to have a conversation, we have it. But every number that we do, that we calculate in every analysis, we don't even factor in those two. That's a side point, sorry. For some of the other calculations, we can provide input from a threat frequency. We see this many attacks against our websites these days, right? So network team or infrastructure team, how often does one of your admins or DBAs fat finger something that we need to fix, right? Those are unknown, or those are not readily shared, but those teams know that. And so when we're calculating, those all come into those calculations.
So in a lot of ways, it's like we've got limited data, and based on these reviews, we have richer data, more data.
Yeah, and just to add to that a little bit, I mean, we've had similar discussions where we're, trying to understand, hey, what would happen if, right? So like one of the ways that we make money is through interest, right? Like overnight, we're moving money around, so we're going through and trying to understand what's the loss of like a ransomware attack or destructive malware or something like that. Well, some of it is you have to take the inherent risk, worst case scenario kind of thing. Like the guy who moves money with the Fed, his phone is out too, and we're not able to move money for 10 days. What would that look like? Knowing full well that actually he can just pick up the phone and the Fed will move it for us. And so there's an inherent mitigation there because there's a whole bunch of backup resiliency processes to make sure that we're able to do that. But some of it's just trying to identify what those assumptions are. Like we're assuming he can't call the Fed, and then we're going back later on and redoing the assessment knowing that he can call the Fed to move money. And that helps pretty dramatically in understanding and almost doing like stress testing those kinds of loss analysis.
You don't have to be right on the data. You all have to be really accurate. If you're wrong together, you're in the right spot because you're all wrong together and you're making decisions together. If you're way off, the team will know it pretty soon, right? The subject matter experts can get together and say, you know what? We had this assumption. Maybe the data wasn't that great. We assumed this. So if it's incorrect, that's okay. We can recalibrate. Whether my loss is 450, my loss exposure is 450 million versus 400 or 375, that's not the point of the exercise.
Yeah, I would, to add my thoughts on that, there's a perception by many people coming into sort of this question of quantification that precision is important, right? That you have to nail these numbers exactly, and that's a fool's errand, right? These are, because of the inherent uncertainty in our data and whatnot, it's more about accuracy, and there's an important difference between precision and accuracy. I can cite a number to 3 decimal points of precision, lots of precision, but if it's profoundly wrong, it hasn't helped, right? But if I can state a range, right, that is not precise, but contains the truth, that's where we win, right? So, how I interpret sort of what Mark just said is, forget about nailing a number exactly, right? Accuracy is what you're aiming for, not precision. And I see organizations, again, struggle with adopting this sort of thing because they're insisting on high levels of precision, and that's a losing game. So any rate. I have one more question for these gentlemen. How much time do we have, Luke? We're good? Okay. I'll have one more question for him. So not if, but the next time assuming that you aren't going to stay forever where you are, and that you move on to a new cool opportunity somewhere else as a CISO, and you want to do this all over again, what would you do differently from what you did in your current organization? And you have the advantage, Mark, because you've been through it twice.
Yeah. So that's a great question. You know, my story at Fannie Mae is a little bit different. When I was working, I came over to Fannie Mae first as the deputy CISO. I used to work with Wade Baker over here on the data breach report for many years, and I came over as the deputy CISO, thinking that I was going to do that for a couple of years before moving on to bigger and better things. And that's when my boss left, and his boss said, "Hey, I'm going to promote you, and oh, by the way, you're going to speak to the board next week." So that was really excited, trial by fire kind of thing. But I think, you know, when I first came over to Fannie Mae, FAIR was top of mind to me. Like it was something that we, when we were at Verizon, were big fans of. Ultimately, some of the data that we were collecting was data that we were trying to leverage to understand risk to organizations better. It was essentially the threat data, and some value of loss data as well, and also just trying to, you know, kill the Pokemon number around cost per record. And I think Wade has some research that he's putting out here soon that will hopefully put the nail in the coffin on that one. But ultimately, I think one of the ways that I would leverage FAIR in a new organization, if I were to ever leave, and since this is being recorded, no, I'm not planning to leave anytime soon, is leveraging this as a way to get alignment with the business and understanding the risk in the business, right? Like CISOs in general, and from where I came from much more of a technical background, but CISOs in, you know, now and even in the future, they have to be business risk executives. They need to understand the risk to their organization, how the company makes money, how the decisions they make around strategy helps them create value, and then how does cyber risk intersect with that. And so I think I would follow a very similar route in that, hey, I'm going to go talk to the right people across the organization, want to understand how our losses become realized. How would cyber risk or operational risk or other types of risk affect that, to help me have those better discussions with the leaders across the organization?
I would say that I have had the opportunity to do this at a couple different companies, and I would say that regardless of what your background is, you're qualified to do this, right? So many of us, in thinking back, I'm not sure I'm ready to have that conversation yet with a CFO. I'm not sure I'm ready to go and have that conversation with the president. That's just fear of man, right? Whatever your background is, and with this model, you are qualified to do this. And to me, I think when I'm talking to my teams and talking to other companies, the idea of who are the stakeholders that you need to communicate to, run an analysis that would affect them or that deals with their team, take it to them and say, hey, here's what we came up with. Here's what I am seeing. Am I off base? Can we make some decisions that will help you generate more revenue, decrease some costs, whatever that value is to them? They're going to be incredibly appreciative, right? It doesn't have to be a big showdown. Like I said before, it doesn't have to be a big public spectacle, where it's at the board meeting and who knows, right? I think people romanticize a lot of what actually happens at a board meeting. But I would just say get after the analyses, and that's probably what I would get after that a lot faster, and then start to socialize versus starting to socialize and bringing up this topic in these areas that they're not 100% familiar with, but they think they are, and then trying to go down that road.
Question right over there.
Sorry, my name is Gianni. I'm in retail as well. I'm wondering are you aligned with other parts of your organization that are helping to deal with risk, like internal audit, fraud prevention, and at what point was it important to get that aligned?
I mean, yeah, for us, certainly had alignment. Ultimately, we're first line risk, and in fact, I not only do I own the information security organization, but I own first line risk for operational, technical, and resiliency risk across the first line as well. And ultimately, yes, we have to have that alignment. Ultimately, the risk managers in the organization are the ones evaluating risk, is like our second line enterprise risk organization. And if they can't leverage what we're doing or be able to understand and challenge what we're doing, then that's just going to create all kinds of problems that you don't want to deal with. And so ultimately, yeah, we had alignment, top to bottom on what we've been doing.
Yeah, so asset protection in our organization, they are involved. Internal audit is involved. They find it fascinating. I mean, it is refreshing for them. If there's another organization that gets beat up more than security, it's internal audit. I mean,
I don't know if that's true.
That's right. That could, right. It's debatable, but the reality is there's. I don't want to say there's safety in numbers, but I've seen people who are very hesitant and downright belligerent towards what you're trying to do become a big fan when 16 other people are telling them that they're full of crap and don't know what they're doing. And we haven't said a word about it. And so getting that buy-in in influencing those teams that this is beneficial for the organization, and it is a new way of thinking, because the old way just flat out doesn't work. I know no one has said that, but it just flat out doesn't. What does it cost to take a red to a yellow? And should I be spending it, right? I mean, we've heard it kind of this week, but so yes, there's buy-in.
So I'll just add to that, where I was a CISO, my relationship with internal audit and enterprise risk management actually improved by applying these, because it made the conversations and discussions and debates not religious, but more logical, rational, data-driven sorts of conversations. And especially the enterprise risk management people tend to be more quantitatively inclined anyway, at least in many organizations. I've seen that not be true, but generally that's the case. And so they really appreciate the rigor and the numeric, nature of this. And even though in many organizations internal audit tends to be more compliance-based and checking boxes, these are smart people too who understand the fact that you have to prioritize, that not all the boxes matter the same. And so if you have a way to have better conversations around that and defend decisions on that, I've had nothing but positive experiences. In fact, when I was at Huntington Bank, internal audit, for IT, actually eventually began when they would hire a new person for their organization, would have that person shadow me for a couple of weeks so that they could see the world through our lens.
Yes, sir.
So managing risk can sometimes be a real downer. We're dealing with loss, we have stakeholders.
It's like economics is the dismal science.
Yeah. So do you think that there would be any value in appealing to people who want to take big risks and show them, what kind of opportunities that there would be, make it a little bit sexier?
Yeah, I mean, we have this discussion all the time, not necessarily about cyber risk, but just around managing risk in an organization around, are we taking the right risks? Is our culture a culture of risk aversion because of the status quo bias that happens in a lot of larger organizations where you just continue what you've been doing forever, kind of thing? And then how do you make sure that you're taking the right risks over time? Because there is an opportunity cost when you're not, when we're not prioritizing the right things, or you're not changing the right things across your organization. You're not taking the right risks, right? Like, and some of these things are difficult to measure, right? Like, you can measure when somebody's taking a risk in investment, right? They're like, hey, you know what? I'm going to go invest in this stock. I'm going to spend this money here. You can measure whether that was a good idea, later down the road, or you can measure an idea in the organization that turns into a product or a service, and the type of revenue that's coming in and the cost benefit that comes from that. It's really hard to measure. I mean, that's why we're here. The cost of not doing something or the cost of doing something, it's hard. And ultimately that's what we're trying to do. But I don't know how to. I haven't learned yet, at least, how to make this sexier, other than to say, hey, I sure don't want to be Maersk.
An example would be, well, let's get rid of all of our on-prem domain controllers and servers and move to the cloud. What would the opportunity be, and how big of a risk would that be before you start going into the losses?
Yeah, and I've been a part of those kinds of analyses where the organization is looking at some major initiative like moving to the cloud, and being able to articulate to them how that affects loss exposure. I mean, when they're thinking about that sort of thing, they tend to have a pretty good idea of what their projected increased revenue would be or decreased costs, those sorts of things. But that third leg of the stool is, what's it do to us from a risk profile perspective? And the most significant study I've done on that for one particular organization showed that, in fact, moving to the cloud increased risk for certain scenarios, but decreased risk for other scenarios, but in net decreased risk significantly. And when the business is used to us coming to the table with don't do that, or it's high risk or whatnot, to be able to come to the table and say, no, here's how it affects us in a more rigorous, logical, and easy to understand fashion that actually stands up under scrutiny. Maybe it's just me, but that's kind of sexy. Yeah, but I know I'm weird, but that's why I do this. It is positive in its effect on the relationship with executives. When you can, and I've experienced this many times as CISO, where I could have a conversation with executives and tell them, no, you don't have to worry about this. Or giving them choices that are really meaningful and really affect the bottom line. I don't know if that's quote unquote sexy, but it does wonders for your credibility in the eyes of them, and that feels really good.
Yeah, I would say the exact same thing of we modeled some big, hairy, audacious goals from some of our business, and it reinforced to them, it showed them kind of the rigor of what we were doing, and the amount of increased risk was less than what was anticipated and what was told to them just in passing. Someone had a bad day. No way, that's too risky, we're not doing it. And sometimes that's the decision, depending on what your title is within an organization. I've seen that many times of we're not going to do it because we shouldn't do it. And I'm basing that off of 10 years ago, I had a situation that went really bad, right? Since that time, that president has called me at least once a month to ask, this is what we're thinking of doing. Should we do it? Can you guys look into this? And so that really helped us, and it was just because of that sexy modeling that we did.
All right.
Mike?
Jack, you mentioned one of the key dependencies
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two different levels of training that I look at for my organization. One is I want the specific hardcore analysis training for this team of folks to focus on. One of the things that we've went through in our organization is a talent architecture, and this is something that's done across the entire Fannie Mae organization, but it's looking at the skills for each of the different roles across the organization. And one of the things that I did a couple of years ago is I combined our risk analysis team that was doing FAIR with our cyber intelligence team. So our cyber intelligence team, we've got, there's basically two different types of cyber intelligence. You got the more strategic threat analysis kinds of things, and then you have the more tactical threat intelligence kinds of things. So the more tactical stuff, that's, hey, these are the malware hashes, the domain names, the IP addresses, et cetera, that we're collecting from various places, and then pushing that out into the telemetry in the organization to understand whether or not we're seeing these kinds of attacks and try to block them. The strategic stuff is more like, hey, we just saw that we added more embargo or more sanctions against Iran, and we know that in 2011, 2012, Iran launched the largest DDoSes in the history of the world at that time against the financial services organization. What do we expect from Iran in that situation? And what I learned, though, is that the same kind of strategic threat intelligence, that sort of structured, logical thinking, was the same kind of techniques that were needed for understanding FAIR and going through a risk analysis. And then even further, like if you really want to understand whether something's a threat to you, you really need to understand the risk that it's going to be going to you as well. So that was really helpful in my mind, is that we could combine those two teams and then leverage the same skill sets and then train that group of people in it. The sort of second level of training is less about the more fundamental number aspect of FAIR, but more about the cultural aspect of thinking like FAIR. So thinking in terms of control strength, thinking in terms of threat frequency and whether it's high. I mean, I have a lot of folks still, and I think a lot of security people always think of threat frequency equals 1. Like, this is going to happen. And that is not the case, right? Like, we can't do this because, yes, we've got to prevent 100% of insider threat being able to potentially move this data, outside the network. Well, we can't create new services if we're always thinking that threat frequency is 1 all the time. We have to think in terms of risk. And so getting that sort of cultural fit around thinking in terms of risk as opposed to the terms that this risk will always happen is probably one of the more difficult things, but that's something that we've tried to focus on with our training.
I'd say that's interesting that you combine those teams. We combine the exact same two teams. It helps with that threat modeling and then understanding what's the control effectiveness, what's the attack path that's going to happen. Is this a kindergarten level attack path? And that, that's a risk discussion versus this is a MIT theory that maybe exists in a lab somewhere and there's no active exploits out. That's a different risk calculation, right? And so I think training the organization to speak in fair terms, you don't have to call it fair terms, but establishing what loss is and what areas of loss we care about, regardless of what we call it, it's gonna be in one of these 6 areas, generally speaking, right? And so that's free of charge. That is just us influencing the organization in a way, and that starts in IT all the way to to our different businesses. And then we're a Risk Lens customer, and so we try to take advantage of whatever training that our teams need on that side of it. Going to stuff like this, going to FairCon.
So we have time for one more question. Yes.
So in terms of like operational metrics that I'm sure that you have in terms of like how well your security controls are doing, can you opine on how those are used within the FAIR model and the various scenarios that you do?
Very well and good. No, I'm just kidding.
Hi.
Hi. I'm going to say.
Sir, can you repeat the question?
Can you repeat that? I was thinking of a smart aleck answer for you. Right? Sorry.
How does operational control effectiveness metrics factor into the model, and like how do you go about doing that with various scenarios?
Okay, so operational control metrics. How's it factor into the model? I'm going to take that first.
Well, I mean, ultimately, in an organization, you need to know what your controls are. You need to measure them, and how well you are actually implementing your controls. Only then can you actually get to the point of measuring whether they're effective or what efficacy you have around your controls. And I think, you talked about this earlier, I think there's some research that's coming out of the FAIR Institute around controls that will greatly help with this kind of thing. I mean, right now, I would say almost every organization that I've been a part of and that I talk to struggle with understanding their controls, measuring the controls, measuring the hygiene across their organization. But ultimately, that is within the model, the way that you measure control strength, that really kind of helps you understand that inherent risk factor. And I wouldn't say that we're doing it like especially well right now, and that's like an opportunity for growth for us.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an opportunity of growth for a lot of organizations. I would say it depends who you're talking to. If we're talking to teams that have a compliance or an audit bend, we will go and associate that control, those controls, to the IT general controls. We map to 300 of them. It's a lot because we have varying brands with different systems, and so when you take an amalgamation of COBIT and ISO and 800 and CSF and PCI, since we're retail, it's an interesting conversation. If I am having a conversation with my security teams or the IT teams, it's a much different conversation around control strength and the efficacy of what we're dealing with on. We may have sweated an asset for 6 years. That's very different than what we just implemented last year, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're describing, when I was at Verizon, like one of the things that we were really trying to understand was when we would research organizations that had data breaches, what controls failed, what controls that they have implemented, so that we could really start to understand what were the actual effective controls. And I think one of the fantastic examples of this, over the last 20 years is like passwords, right? So what was it in 1989, 1990, NIST came out with this password standard. The guy who wrote that standard way back when has come back and said, I was wrong, but we've basically been basing our password complexity requirements, the entire industry, on it for the last 20 years, and realize it's actually made the problem worse as opposed to better. And that's an example of, hey, here's a control that everyone thought was effective. It's actually not effective because it creates different risks. And it creates the Post-it note risk, right? Because now you have to remember this weird password, and you have to change it every 5 days. It's just one of those things that I think is going to take a while for us to really understand how controls in your environment operate, but then how they interact with other controls in the environment to create that sort of defense in depth across the organization.
So a couple of things. One of the advantages to the FAIR model is that when you're actually looking at the ontology in the context of doing an analysis, you can say, well, let's look at threat event frequency, and part of that is contact frequency. If you look down the next level in the model, what kind of controls do we have in place that reduce contact frequency? It might be web application firewalls for a web app that you're trying to protect, or it might be your hiring practices background checks and that sort of thing, reducing the contact with potentially problematic employees. The bottom line here is the model gives you a lens to see and evaluate your controls through. Is it easy? No. In fact, I would argue that controls analytics is by far the most complex dimension of doing these analyses. And the FAIR model itself doesn't include that. It just provides this lens to look at your controls through. The good news is, later this year, the FAIR Institute will be publishing a controls analytics model. Because in the last year, I've cracked a couple of nuts that sort of opened up how to do this. And the whole goal of this framework is to make control efficacy empirically measurable. And so it should make this whole problem a lot easier. In the meantime, this is where the expertise of the individuals in your organization and the critical thinking comes into play. But it is the most challenging dimension in my mind around doing these analyses. It's just harder work, but it'll be getting easier. But in the meantime, again, the model provides a very effective lens for doing it better than you would do otherwise, but it's still just not as simple as it could or should be. But more to come. So that is all the time we have for this. If you would please join me in thanking these fine gentlemen for their wisdom.